Zahal Reed, Senior Staff Attorney in Medmark's Risk Management Department. I would like to welcome you back to Medmark's Risk Management video series on clinical trials. In previous videos, we provided you with an overview of clinical trials, and we discussed the product's liability implications of clinical trials. In this video, we will review the informed consent process. If you are ready to start phase 1 of your clinical trial, you might begin with subject recruitment through advertising. Once you have a group of individuals who are interested in participating in your clinical trial, this is where the informed consent process begins. You want to educate these potential subjects on what they can expect during the clinical trial. You will explain your protocol to them, and most importantly, you will inform them of the potential risks and benefits of the trial. There is always a tension between educating subjects on the potential risks and benefits and not scaring the subjects out of participating. Remember that your trial will be useless if it cannot recruit subjects on a scale that will result in the data required for the end product's application to FDA. However, this should not prevent you from being completely transparent with your potential subjects. You will screen the potential pool of candidates with your inclusion and exclusion criteria in hand. And during this process, you will provide the subjects with the informed consent document. Note that the informed consent process and the informed consent document are not the same thing. Informed consent does not begin and end with the informed consent document because truly informed consent is about more than just obtaining a signature. You can locate the FDA informed consent requirements in 21 CFR 50.20. If you are submitting an investigational new drug application to FDA, you do not need to include a copy of the informed consent document unless FDA requests it. However, for significant risk medical devices, the informed consent document must be included in the application for investigational device exemptions for FDA review. The informed consent process should start with a consent interview, but who do you need to get informed consent from? To be legally effective, it must be obtained from the subject or their legal representative. After the initial interview, you may present them with the informed consent document. In this key document, you want to lay out a description of the clinical investigation using language that is understandable to your trial participants. You want to review any foreseeable risks or discomforts that the subject may experience in the course of the clinical trial. You want to describe any benefits the subject may reasonably expect. You want to disclose any potential alternative procedures or course of treatment available. You want to let the subjects know the extent to which confidentiality of records identifying the subjects will be maintained and that FDA may inspect the records. For research involving more than minimal risk, discuss compensation, the availability of medical treatments in case of injury, and where they can obtain more information. Additionally, you must instruct the subjects on how and where to contact the appropriate individual if they have any questions and who to contact in case of emergency. You need to make sure the subjects know that their participation is entirely voluntary and that they are allowed to refuse and withdraw from the trial at any time without penalty. Note that your informed consent document must be approved by the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. But frequently, sponsors and investigators mistakenly believe that just because they received approval from their IRB, it means that they have fully protected themselves from products liability stemming from the informed consent document. To protect yourself from potential liability down the line, when you are drafting your informed consent document, here are a few questions to consider. Consider whether your document is written at an 8th grade or lower reading comprehension level. Have you done everything practicable to make the information clear? Would the information be clearer if you used videos or pictures? Can your subjects be expected to understand the document provided? For example, have you given your subjects a massive document with small print and no further explanation? Have you made sure that all participants are instructed in a language that they can understand? Have you screened the process for any potential undue influence? And have you considered creating a video recording of the informed consent interview? When you are drafting your informed consent document, always try to imagine how it would play out in court, because the informed consent document can be a source of product liability. Here are some additional elements that may be included in your informed consent document if appropriate. You may inform the subjects of any unexpected risks, such as potential risks for the subject or unborn baby if the subject becomes pregnant during the course of the trial. The subject should be informed if there's a risk that the subject's participation may be terminated, for example, termination of participation for failure to follow the trial requirements. The subjects should be informed of any costs they may incur due to their participation in the trial. They should be informed if there are any risks associated with leaving the study early. They should be informed of significant new findings that may relate to their willingness to continue participation, such as new risk information. When it's appropriate, the subject should know the approximate number of participants enrolled in the study. Next, we are going to look at undue influence. Coercion and undue influence is an area of particular concern that should be carefully considered. Although coercion is a relatively straightforward concept, undue influence is where most investigators and sponsors can run into issues. Here's a list of questions to consider when you're drafting your informed consent document. What is the relationship between the investigator and the subject? Is the subject employed by the sponsor or investigator? Is the participant receiving compensation? If so, is it reasonable or over-enticing? Have you made any unproven claims of effectiveness or benefit, either implicitly or explicitly, that could entice the subject? Have you provided the participant with ample time to make a decision? In what setting did you ask their permission? Did you ask them in the preoperative area or in the operating room? The setting may unduly influence the subject. Have you used phrases such as FDA has given permission or FDA has approved? Subjects may believe FDA is much more involved in the clinical trial if you use these sorts of phrases, which might give them a false sense of security. Also, even though an IRB has approved your study, stating this in an informed consent document might create a false sense of security for the subjects, so they feel they don't need to review the clinical trial protocols for themselves. Lastly, you should view informed consent as an ongoing process. Clinical trials inherently lack predictability. As such, you may need to revisit your protocol frequently. You need to determine whether any revisions made to the protocol are significant enough to require a change to the informed consent document. You will need to submit any changes made to your IRB for approval. Remember that the informed consent process is far greater than obtaining a signature on an informed consent document. No matter how comprehensive your informed consent document may be, it will not matter if your subject does not truly understand what they're consenting to. For this reason, it is important to plan out the steps in this process prior to recruitment. This concludes our video on the informed consent process of clinical trials, and we hope you will join us for our next video where we will discuss the clinical trial agreement in more detail. This concludes our video for today.